Hello and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is returning the wild to the wilderness, loss, restoration, and new opportunity. And with us is Thomas Keller, the Furbearer Biologist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He earned a master's degree in conservation biology from Green Mountain College and a bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries science from the Pennsylvania State University. He's worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as serving in several biologist roles within the Game Commission before coming to this current position. Hello, Tom, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, good afternoon, Beth, and thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Game Commission.
Sure. So I serve as the furbearer biologist. And so what that really means is we have 16 different furbearer species in Pennsylvania. And that ranges everything from the least weasel up to the coyote and everything in between. And so my job is to help manage those throughout the state for Pennsylvanians.
So the topic of today's program is loss, restoration, and new opportunity regarding the American marten. Sounds like there's a lot of history about the marten in our state. What will you be sharing with us?
Yeah, there certainly is. So today we're going to start by talking about some of the history of wildlife and wildlife conservation and management in Pennsylvania. And then we're eventually going to get to the point where we talk about marten, this native species that was once common, but has since been extirpated. And we're talking about currently potentially reintroducing the species to the state. And then we'll walk through what that looks like in determining feasibility and how that process works.
Tom, when you are ready, you can begin.
Okay. So just like any good story in Pennsylvania, when we talk about wildlife management, wildlife conservation, we have highs and we have lows and everything in between. And really in Pennsylvania, we need to start with kind of some of the losses, some of the low parts of our history with management in Pennsylvania. And we think about historically what Pennsylvania would have looked like pre-European settlement. This is what we think about. We think about huge trees, and we think about the majority of our state being covered by these massive forests, and these forests would have been teeming with wildlife. And what we see in Pennsylvania as the early settlers kind of came into Pennsylvania from the Philadelphia area, settlement begins in the southeast and slowly starts to creep across throughout the state. In the early 1700s, we see it very slowly coming out because at that time, one family could clear 4 to 5 acres per year. And that's because of the tools they were using and the manpower that they had. But by the late 1700s, we start to see settlement really starting to move across southern Pennsylvania and up into the northeast. And we think about what's happening in that time. Pennsylvania is going from a colony to an early state in this new nation, and it needs the resources. And Pennsylvania becomes the keystone state in providing those resources, such as timber. By the early 1800s, 1820, we can see that most of Pennsylvania has been settled. And the last bastion of wilderness is really up in that north central to northwestern portion of the state. By the time we get to the early 1900s, all of Pennsylvania has been settled for the most part, and we start to see forest products coming out of Pennsylvania at a much faster rate than what they can regrow. Most of that's because of steam power. Steam power and new technology comes into the state. We're starting to pull timber out. And by the time we get to the early 1900s, this is what Pennsylvania looks like throughout the state. Most of it's been cleared, and we don't have anything left as far as trees go, except for in a very few locations. And you can see those places today, like Cook State Forest, where we have some virgin timber. And it's not just the trees that we lose. By the late 1800s, we've lost the elk and the beaver. By 1900, the mountain lion, the gray wolf, and the American marten have disappeared. And by the 1920s, the fisher is gone. And as Pennsylvania transitions from what was once a forested state to an agricultural state, we start to see some other issues crop up. With the advent of pesticides in the 50s and the 60s, especially DDT, we see the osprey disappear and the peregrine falcon disappear in the mid 1970s. By 1983, there are 3 bald eagle nests left within the state. And as we see agriculture continue to develop into clean farming with new technology. By the late 1990s, the bobwhite finally disappears. And it's not just these species that are completely extirpated. We also need to consider species like the wild turkey and the white-tailed deer, which are driven to the very near brink, as well as the river otter. But like any good story, Pennsylvania has a redemption story, and there's a turning point. And what we see is that Pennsylvania forests start to regrow, and they regrow on their own, but we also see organizations like the CCC planting hundreds of thousands of trees throughout the state. But unfortunately, even with the tree regrowth and the forest starting to come back, many of these species are gone, and some are very close to disappearing. And so Pennsylvanians are very concerned. And Pennsylvanians cry out to their legislator and say, look, we need to do something here, because it's not just the deforestation, it's also unregulated harvest. We think about this time, we're thinking about a time where market hunting is cleaning off many of the species and sending these animals to places like New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia to feed the people in those cities. But that's taking away from rural Pennsylvanians who are relying on that for food. And so in 1895, the Pennsylvania Game Commission is formed, and were formed primarily to develop rules and regulations to stop market hunting and to stop the mass slaughter of many of these species that we're losing. At the same time, Pennsylvania Forestry Commission, which is really the precursor to DCNR, is buying up a lot of what we call valueless timber. It's these areas that have been cleared, and the loggers know that it would be 100, 150 years until we see that the trees come back. And so they're selling this land for pennies on the dollar. And we have enough forethought within this agency to start buying this land up. In the early 1900s, we see the U.S. Forest Service come in and start to buy up a large chunk of land in the Northwest. And just with these three agencies alone, we have many millions of acres in the state of Pennsylvania. And these acres of public land belong to you and your kids and your grandkids. And that's a wonderful thing. And it's important when we think about looking forward to actually restoring some of these species. When we look at where the public acres lay out within the state, we can see that we have public lands throughout much of Pennsylvania, but most of the core areas are really up in that northern tier. So we begin what we call legacy of restoration, and we begin it fairly early. As early as 1913, 1914, we begin to reintroduce white-tailed deer. We bring deer in from over 7 different states, and we start to release them throughout Pennsylvania, primarily in the southern tier, to bring back our deer population. Now we have a healthy, in some cases it's too abundant. Management for deer has really become important as we think about how do we manage deer and forests within the state, but we've been very successful. We harvest many deer throughout the state. And then we start to bring back elk at that same time. We bring elk in from the west, from Wyoming, from Yellowstone, where they're overpopulated. We put them onto rail cars and bring them into the state, put them into wagons, and take them out into the forests in the northern tier. And now we have a healthy elk population where we also have the ability to harvest elk each year. In the 1920s, we bring back the beaver, and it's the perfect time to bring the beaver back because we have all this early successional growth throughout much of the state along our rivers and streams, around our ponds and our lakes. And the beaver takes off. We bring it in from several different states and Canadian provinces, and now we have healthy beaver populations throughout the state, and really in the northern tiers where most of our good beaver habitat is today. And then and then the wild turkey. And the wild turkey, we failed a few times. We tried to raise and release turkeys in captivity and take them out to the wild, and that did not work very well. So we tried a few other things, but really what worked the best was bringing in wild birds, not just from other states, but primarily from our northern tier. And the remaining birds that we had left in Pennsylvania, we started to trap and transfer them throughout the rest of the state. And wild turkey restoration in Pennsylvania has really led the nation. And contributed to wild turkey restoration in other states as we began to trap and transfer turkeys to other states for their own restoration projects. As early as the 1980s, we began to bring eaglets down from Canada and build what we call hacking towers, and what you see here. And this hacking tower was a place where we raise these eaglets and they imprint on this location. And then when they become adults and are able to reproduce, they come back to the location where they were raised and they begin to build a nest and then raise their own young. And what we saw was phenomenal. We saw eagles take off within the state. And recently they were delisted, and we have eagles throughout Pennsylvania. And for our generation who remember a time without eagles, and now we see eagles all the time, that's really a special thing. And I think our younger generation, my daughter's generation, doesn't really appreciate that because she's grown up with eagles, but we certainly do that haven't. At the same time, we start to see osprey. We're bringing osprey back into the state through reintroduction. We're bringing peregrine falcons back into the state through reintroduction. Now we have osprey on every major body of water. We have peregrine falcons in Harrisburg and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. We also have them on many of their historic cliff nesting locations throughout the state. Also in the early 80s, we begin otter reintroduction. And this is spearheaded by Dr. Tom Surface, working with our agency. And over 20 years, we release 153 otters in 7 different locations throughout Pennsylvania. Now, remember, we never lost otters completely. There was still a small remnant population in the Poconos, but this really gave them a good kickstart. Now we have otter throughout the state. We get otter sightings in Philadelphia. And up on Presque Isle, they just had their first otter detection since the reintroduction effort. And so we've seen great success with otters as well. And then most recently was the fisher. In the mid-90s, we began fisher reintroductions. And we did have some fishers starting to move their way up from a reintroduction in West Virginia into the southwest of the state. But we also released fisher throughout the northern tier of Pennsylvania. And now fisher continue to occupy new areas and good habitat throughout the state. And every year we have a continually successful harvest season, and we are seeing fisher populations continue to increase and expand. Now, the next one that's coming up very soon is the bobwhite quail. And as early as spring of next year, we'll be releasing bobwhite quail down in Franklin County. And we've been working very hard on public and private lands down in that area because this was one of the last strongholds of quail within the state. And so we're really excited to work with other partners in different states to capture quail and bring them into Pennsylvania to restore that population. But there's several species that we didn't talk about that were on that original timeline. And 2 of those would be extremely challenging. We think of those 2 as the gray wolf and the mountain lion. And they're challenging because they're apex predators. And it's not necessarily that we may not have the habitat there, because we may, and we may not have the food source there because we may, but really what it comes down to is the social aspect. Are Pennsylvanians ready for those 2 species to come back to the state? And we need to do some survey work to understand that, but at this time it would be very difficult. But there's one species we didn't talk about, and most people have probably forgotten about. And the American marten disappeared over 120 years ago. And so there's been generations of humans that have been gone. And so most of us just aren't familiar with it. And in order to determine whether we should or shouldn't reintroduce the species, we really need to refamiliarize ourselves with it. And the first part of that is developing what we call a feasibility assessment for reintroduction. And there's several critical factors that need to be considered as we walk through that. The first of those is, what does the history of marten in Pennsylvania look like, and what's their basic ecology? The second is habitat, and really, do we have marten habitat still remaining within the state? Third, we have to look at what are the potential impacts of marten, not just to other species, but also from other species to marten. Fourth, we need to look at past reintroductions. Has this ever been done before? And if it has, what can we learn from those past reintroductions? And finally, justification. Why would we consider this? Do we really have good reasons to move forward? And we really should before we would consider something like this. So the first thing was to look at history, to look at some of the historical records in Pennsylvania from early explorers, early settlers. We needed to look at early trapping records as well as museum records. And what we found is in Pennsylvania, marten were once a very common native species to the state. And they would have ranged throughout much of the forested areas, which was much of Pennsylvania. Martens actually range as far south as northern Tennessee, and then, of course, up into Maine and into Canada. But what we saw was in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, complete deforestation, along with unregulated harvest, is really what drove the marten to extirpation. And then during that last part of the 1800s, this is kind of where we would have expected to see marten. And so we have some records showing us that the last stronghold, again, would have been up in that northern, north central tier. And that makes sense because that's the last place that would have been settled or would have been cleared. Now, as far as ecology or biology of the marten, we need to kind of find out where it falls in with other species as far as size and weight go. The marten weighs an average of 2 pounds and can average between 20 to 24 inches. As far as where it falls in, it's in the weasel family. And in the weasel family in Pennsylvania, we have the true weasels, so the least, the short-tailed and the long-tailed, the whole way up to the river otter. But it's actually the same size as the mink. And in this picture, you can see we have a fisher on the left, and then the marten, a mink, and a fox squirrel. And that gives you a better idea of how big the marten really is in the grand scheme of things. And as far as diet goes, a real general look at diet tells us that the majority of what marten eat are small mammals. And when we say that, we mean rodents, mice, shrews, and voles. They eat a lot of plant material, a lot of seeds, soft mass and hard mass. And then they eat a lot of insects. That makes up a significant portion of their diet. But they are an omnivore, so they eat birds and squirrels and hare and rabbits. In this other category, we see things like fish and reptiles, amphibians and carrion. And we're going to dive a little deeper into diet here within a few slides. As far as habitat goes for the marten, this picture probably does way more justice than what I can put into words. But what we talk about when we talk about marten is really the two words structural complexity. And that just means that there's a lot going on within the forest. We see downed woody debris. We see root balls and rock piles. We see an understory, a midstory, and an overstory. And within that overstory, we have lots of cavities, dead trees and live trees with lots of cavities within them. And this is all very important for the marten. But what we're looking at here is what we would consider a healthy forest. That's what we're trying to manage for throughout Pennsylvania. And healthy forests aren't just good for marten. They're good for grouse and turkeys, wood rats, and goshawks. Now, when we think about habitat, we need to consider we obviously had habitat at one time, but do we still have habitat within the state? And what we found is that we do, and we have it in quantity, quality, and connectivity. But how do we know that? Well, the first thing we did was build a habitat suitability model. And really what we're looking at is what do marten need within these different layers? So we look at land cover and snow cover, percent canopy cover and canopy height. And putting all these together with the specific needs of marten gives us a map that looks like this. And what we see in this map is in really dark green, that's where we have our best marten habitat. And as it gets lighter, it becomes poorer habitat. Now, why would we build it for these other states, for the Northeast and Michigan? The reason is we needed to be able to truth this map or this suitability model against where we know we have marten. And when we know where we have marten is these locations. And when you look at where those dark green areas are in these other states, they line up very nicely. So that gives us confidence that our model is correct. When we look at Pennsylvania specifically, we see that most of that good habitat is in that northern tier. And that's important. We see that some is in the southern tier, but on these ridge and valleys, it's mainly fragmented. But the other thing is public land, and we talked about how much public land we have in Pennsylvania. That becomes very important because public land is in long-term management plans. For some of our forest management plans, those plans stretch over 100 years long. Remember, we're growing trees and it takes a long time. And so when we think about the importance of public land, we think about the importance of maintaining habitat for the long term. But we didn't just develop a model. We brought experts in from other different states that have worked with marten most of their careers and had them look at this on the ground. We spent several days traveling across the top of the state, looking at our good habitat, our poor habitat, and making sure that they felt that our suitability model was correct. And they did. And in some cases, they actually stated that we had better marten habitat in Pennsylvania than where they have actual marten in their own states. So that was encouraging to know that our model was good. Now, we also have to figure out, are there negative impacts from martens to other species? What we found is it's very minimal. But how do we know that? And the first thing is, what are these other species? So we looked at a variety of different species in Pennsylvania, and we looked very closely at species that have a status of species of greatest conservation need or threatened or endangered. And so we looked at species that are in decline or species that are just very important to constituents. We looked at the wood rat and the snowshoe hare, the ruffed grouse, the northern flying squirrel, looked at the northern goshawk, and we looked at the wild turkey. And then we also looked at a variety of other species, but the best way we can determine if there's going to be negative impacts is to look at their diet and to look at it very closely. So we looked at 13 different diet studies from across the marten range, much of which overlaps these other animals that we're concerned about. And here's what that looked like. And there's a lot to look at, but the first thing is look at how many different species are on this chart. Again, it's a true omnivore, what we call a facultative generalist. It eats what it can find. But really, what makes up the majority of what's on this chart? What we see is it's these small mammals, the voles, the shrews, the mice. If you look at number 4, we have insects. You can see how important insects are to the marten. Now, how do these other species that we referenced earlier, how do they shake out? So we see in the middle, we have the snowshoe hare. And then as we drop down, we see the ruffed grouse. We have a bushy-tailed wood rat, which is a good stand-in for the Allegheny because the Allegheny's range does not overlap. And then we have our flying squirrels, both our northern and our southern. There's 2 species on that original slide, the northern goshawk and the wild turkey, that we didn't see within this chart. The goshawk we looked very closely at, we found one instance in the early 40s of a marten killing a goshawk. And since then, we found several instances of goshawks killing marten. So they seem to be fairly evenly matched. But the turkey we couldn't find anywhere. And that wasn't just adults, but that was eggs, and that was also poults. And so we dug into turkey research. We talked to turkey biologists in other states. And what we found is that the marten is just not a major predator for the turkey. Now, I'm not saying because we didn't find it that they wouldn't eat a turkey poult if they happened to cross one. We just don't have any evidence that it happened. And so that's telling us that there wouldn't be a major impact to turkey populations. We also know that they do eat eggs. In all of the 13 studies, we found 2 instances where there was eggshell fragments in the stomach, but that was only 2 out of thousands. And so we know that eggs are part of the diet, but they're not a very important part of the diet. So we would assume they wouldn't have a large impact on eggs. What is interesting, and I like to point out, is that American marten eat other marten. And that's not totally surprising because when we've done fisher diet studies in Pennsylvania, we also see that female fisher eat quite a bit of other fisher. We don't know why exactly, but we do know it occurs, and we know it occurs with marten as well. Now, we also need to consider negative impacts from other species to marten. We've also found this is minimal, but it's minimal in areas where several things exist. And where we talk about other species, we're not just talking about the fisher, but the bobcat, the coyote, and even other weasels competing for the same food resources. And when they have enough prey abundance, we know that they can coexist. And in Pennsylvania, we do have enough prey abundance. We have very high prey abundance of small mammals, which are important for the marten and these other species. We also know that snowfall is very important. And in Pennsylvania, when we look at where our highest snowfall is at, we see that the majority of it is up in that northern tier. Martens spend the majority of their winter under the snow layer, and that way they can outcompete for these food resources. When we say that, we mean primarily rodents, where these other species may not be able to go. And finally, this idea of microhabitat and habitat driven by topography and also elevation. We have both topography and elevation in spades up in this northern tier where we have our best marten habitat. We also wanted to look at what does the future look like? And so we looked at what could negative impacts from future climatic changes, how could that impact marten? And so we looked at several different models, and this is the Nature Conservancy's model. And we see that the majority of our northern tier at our higher elevations would remain very resilient and unchanged should we see this climatic change over time. In some of the lower areas, we do see that there would be major impacts to forests as well as other habitat. And then asking that question, has this ever been done before? And in reality, the marten is one of the most often reintroduced fur-bearer species in North America. And most of the reintroductions have proven very largely successful, but not all. But we can learn from the failures and we can learn from the success. And when we look at where marten have been reintroduced, we see these little white dots throughout northern North America. And what we see is very interesting. In some cases, marten have been reintroduced to places like the Black Hills of South Dakota or islands off the coast of Alaska or the coast of the Great Lakes. And in these very small areas with good habitat, marten have persisted over time. And that's important as we consider the amount of habitat we have in Pennsylvania and how marten would potentially do there. And it would likely be very successful in Pennsylvania as well, based on our habitat model. Now, we do need to talk about justification. Why would we consider this? And there's many different reasons that span a variety of different categories. The first, ecologically, we know that this was once a native common species to the state. And we know that it played a very important role. And it's not just this idea of it being a part of the ecosystem, but what did it do? And we know that marten were important for things like seed dispersal and rodent population management. We also have this idea of biological diversity in Pennsylvania. And of course, it's often used as a buzzword, but in reality, it's very important. And we see that in all of our major plans, our strategic plans, our sister agencies' plans, and trying to not just decrease this loss of biological diversity, but also just to hold on. And this is one of the few chances we actually have to increase biological diversity within the state. Culturally, we know this was important for many of the indigenous peoples that lived around the Great Lakes region. And of course, Pennsylvania would have been a part of that. And we know it was important as a clan animal in their legends and stories. But we also know it was important to many of the early settlers in Pennsylvania and explorers. It was used in the fur trade. It was used as a commodity. Economically, it can be very difficult to put any kind of a price or dollar amount on a reintroduction. But in reality, when we look at the elk reintroduction, we look at eagles and peregrines, and the amount of folks that come into the state or just residents that travel to see these species, and that's just to see or hear these species or take pictures. There's also the flip side. There's the consumptive side of hunters and trappers. And we often forget about white-tailed deer and wild turkey. And the hundreds of thousands of hunters and trappers in Pennsylvania spending millions of dollars that goes directly back into wildlife management within the state. Now, we talked earlier about these social side of wildlife management, particularly in relation to gray wolves and mountain lions. And that's also important for the marten. So we've done several different public opinion surveys. We've actually done 3. And what we found is that around 90 to 92% of Pennsylvanians support marten reintroduction back to the state. And a high percentage, between 87 to 92% of hunters, also support it. But we see there's some opposition, between 7 to 9% opposition within the state as well. And the last reason is really this idea of this legacy that we've built. And it's not just that we've brought these species back, it's that there's been generations of Pennsylvanians bringing species back over the past 100 years and leading this nation in rewilding their state. It's my grandparents that brought back the turkey and the white-tailed deer. It's my parents' generation that brought back the river otter and the bald eagle. And it's our generation that's bringing back the bobwhite quail and has the potential to bring back the American marten. Now, what does this look like in the long term? The first thing that we did was to develop this feasibility assessment. The next thing that we're working on, and we've completed, is to develop a reintroduction and management plan, which lays out where would we put marten in Pennsylvania? Where would we get marten from? What partnerships would we work with? And really, how would we get marten from point A to point B safely and successfully? And so we've developed this plan. We presented that to our board at the July meeting several weeks ago, and we asked our board to release that for public review and comment. The board decided to table it, awaiting one more public opinion survey. And so we're going to try to move that forward again at our next meeting to see if we can get this out for public review and comment. Because in Pennsylvania, wildlife belongs to all Pennsylvanians, and all Pennsylvanians should be a part of this process. If it is moved out for public review and comment, then that would come back and we would develop a final draft that would go back to our board for a final vote to determine whether we should or shouldn't move forward with reintroduction. I do want to just say that we have involved many other agencies, both in Pennsylvania and outside, as well as other organizations. And that's so important to include stakeholders in this process throughout. So with that, I know Beth has some information at the end, but I always throw this slide up. If folks do have questions and you're not able to get them in today, I'm happy to answer them at any other time. If you want to learn more, we have a story map online. We also have a Marten web page where you can learn a lot more. There's videos and webinars and all kinds of other things that are really helpful to answer questions that I wasn't able to get to today. So with that, I'm going to close out and turn it back over to Beth for any Q&A that's come in.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that information. It was a really great reminder about why the health and wellness of Pennsylvania's animals and their population need to be monitored. So, and the process for decision-making for reintroduction is very thorough. So, well done. We do have questions. Let's get to some questions. First off, we'll start with a non-question, which is just a compliment on you and your presentation. And one of our audience members said that the Game Commission is fortunate to have a biologist of your caliber on staff. So
that's very nice. Thank you so much.
So a couple questions about the opposition to the reintroduction. What were the reasons given that people did not want reintroduction for the marten?
Most of our opposition really revolved around this idea of it potentially negatively impacting species and species that people really care a lot about. And that makes us really happy that people really are passionate about specific species. A lot of the opposition in Pennsylvania was geared towards turkeys. And so primarily likely from turkey hunters. And again, that's a group that really cares deeply about the wild turkey in Pennsylvania and do a lot of wonderful things for turkeys, as well as grouse. We had some that were really concerned about grouse. Of course, with a declining grouse population, there is that concern. But that's always where we kind of went back to the diet side of things and why it was so important to look at diet and look at as many different diet studies as we can, especially in those areas where they overlap with grouse or with turkeys or hare or goshawks, whatever the species of interest might be, to really understand, is there going to be that potential for a negative impact? And really, we didn't find that. We really found that, again, those three primary diet items are things like small mammals, plant material and insects. We know they eat some of these other things, but it's very low as far as how much they're eating or frequency of occurrence within their diet.
Was there any concern that repopulating the marten would affect human population in the state?
That's a good question. Yeah, I haven't had a lot of concern there. We did have some concern that revolved around domestic animals. So we had some concern with cats and dogs. We had some concern specifically with livestock and more specifically with chickens. And of course, right now in Pennsylvania, we probably have more chicken owners than we've had in quite some time. Mainly backyard flocks, but of course we do also have some big producers here within the state. And so that was something that we also looked at to see, how often are they predating on these other things. And we really didn't see any pet predation and really couldn't find any evidence of domestic stock predation either. And again, I would not say that it has never happened, but again, when we think about this animal, there's several important things to think about. One, it's 2 pounds. It's the size of a mink. So as far as pets go, it's generally not a concern. But we do know that mink will take things like chickens, but it's also where it lives. So again, this is an animal of the wilderness. This is an animal that's core forest areas. And it's not to say we don't have chicken owners that don't live in some of these more remote areas, but we probably have very few. And then I always, encourage folks, as long as we're doing our proper predation management, if we're chicken owners, and I am a chicken owner, and making sure we have the correct fencing up and are doing our due diligence to protect them against mink and weasels and raccoons, and they would be protected against marten as well.
Is there an idea about how many breeding pairs would need to be established or need to be brought in to establish a population in an area? And a follow-up on that would be, what would be an ideal population density?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so what we know as far as how many marten we need for a specific area, we know that we need at least 60 individuals for an area that is at least 42 kilometers square. And so really we're looking at release sites that are larger than that. That's a minimum. And that 60 individuals is also a minimum. So we would like to get more than 60. And then as far as sex ratio goes, it's not necessarily in pairs, because the way martens set up their territories is you'll have female territories and they do not overlap. So if you picture several circles that do not overlap and they are a little bit smaller, and then with males, they do overlap females, but do not overlap other males. And so you'll see a larger male circle that would overlap several different females, and he would breed with those females. So we actually need more females than we do males. So just several males, but the most of those 60 we would hope to be females. And then so that's kind of what we would be looking for. And as far as density goes, there's not a lot in the literature about specific density numbers. What we do see is that density changes depending on habitat. So with really good quality habitat, you'll see a much denser population. With poor quality habitat, you see density decrease because they need larger territories to fulfill their needs. So that's a question that's really difficult to answer, but it's a good question. And that would be one thing if we would move forward with this project. Those are all questions that we would be looking at within our research as part of the project.
Will repopulation affect the marten population in surrounding states?
Good
And if
question.
so, like what kind of communication happens between the states and the management of fur-bearing animals?
Yeah, excellent questions. So it would not impact other state populations. So the nearest population we have is the Adirondacks. And when you look at, if I would bring up that habitat suitability model, what you would see is the Adirondacks have really good habitat, but it's surrounded by really poor habitat. And with marten, they're so dependent on habitat. They're unlike the fisher or the bobcat or the coyote. They're a little bit more adaptable. The marten is not adaptable. So it's not able to come out of that good quality habitat because it actually has other predators, and primarily birds of prey, things like hawks and owls, and then other predators that may cause mortality. And so they really stick to good quality habitat. but that also prevents them from dispersing into other areas or across really poor habitat. So in Pennsylvania, if we would do a release, most of our good habitat is in state, but some of it does go up into New York. And that gets to that second question, is how are we working with other states? And that was really important when we started to develop this. In fact, we sent our feasibility assessment to other states, and I mentioned we had been working with other states as well. And then, of course, when we developed our plan, our reintroduction plan that was just developed, we really worked closely with other states because we would need to get marten from other states and provinces. We don't have any in Pennsylvania, so we need to work with them. And so how that works is I would contact my colleagues at my level in those other states and to kind of begin that discussion. But then we would send formal letters, which we did, to these other states at the executive director level to say, hey, would you be willing to support this project? It's not a contract, it's just the idea of, would you be willing to help us? And at this point, we've received several of those letters back. And then if this gets approved, we go back to those states and say, okay, how many marten would you be willing to provide to us? Is there a cost associated with that? Or is there a trade associated with that? How does that work? And that's generally the process that we would work through as we partner with these other state agencies or Canadian provinces.
You mentioned raptors such as the great horned owl. Since they're predators of the marten, if the marten population increases, are we going to see an increase in owl or other raptor population?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's likely not, and that's primarily because the marten has such a big home range. It's about a 3.5 mile square on average home range, which is huge for such a small animal. So that means that overall density of martens, even in good habitat, is fairly low. And so we don't, it's not a species like a rabbit or like a field mouse or things like that where they reproduce, they have a lot of young. Marten actually can have anywhere from 1 to 5 young. On average, they have 3, and 2 usually come to adulthood. They have a fairly, they're fairly good at raising their young, but again, they're only maybe producing 2 to 3, which is barely replacing the parents. So it's a very slow growing population. It's fairly low density. And so you wouldn't expect that to really impact other predator species populations. And really, as long as marten are in their good habitat, mortality, it can be fairly low as long as they're, again, within that good habitat.
But how does snowfall impact marten ecology? Why is
Yeah,
it an important factor for them?
we kind of started to cover that. We just scratched the surface, but really, marten in the wintertime will spend the majority of their time under the snow layer. And we think of that layer, which is called the subnivean layer, which is the space between the snow and the ground. There's actually a space under there in most cases. In some cases, it does lay directly on the ground. When we looked at that habitat picture and all of that busyness or brushiness going on at the base of the forest floor with those logs and rocks and root balls, all of that is creating spaces. And that's where marten will spend most of their time hunting and being protected from other predators and protection from the elements, because that's where most of the small mammals are at. And so with a good snowfall, marten can get underneath that and won't come up very often throughout the winter. And so that, again, helps keep them safe and provides food. But in areas where there's not as much snow, which in some winters, like this past winter, we didn't have a lot of snow, they're able to take advantage of cavities, and they utilize cavities more so to kind of take the place of some of what the snow provides.
So should this be approved, what would be the anticipated timing for reintroduction?
Yeah, so we'll just say when we don't know when they would actually have a vote, if we make it to that point and have a vote. But if there would be a vote, what we would expect is if it's approved, we know that we're probably at least a year to year and a half out before we would start actually trapping and transferring marten. And that's really just because, again, when we talked about partnering with other states and provinces, and in some cases, if we would be bringing marten in from from across the border, there's a lot of paperwork that goes into that. There's a lot of coordination that has to take place, and all that's in our plan. So we have a good plan. Should that be accepted in place, But it still would take us at least a year, year and a half, maybe even up to 2 before we would see marten actually hit the ground in Pennsylvania.
And how can the public participate in the upcoming surveys and give their input?
Yeah, so at this point, it hasn't been released for public review and comment. If the board would approve it to be released for public review and comment, we would encourage all of the public, whether you support or oppose or aren't sure, to at least read that plan and weigh in on it. Again, because it's so important, because really wildlife belongs to the public. And we are just here as stewards to help manage it. I would encourage you to get a hold of your commissioner. You can write in to the Pennsylvania Game Commission and encourage your commissioners. If you're interested in seeing this released to the public, that would be one way to be able to get a hold of it and hopefully help them make a decision to release it to the public. But yeah, that would be how I would encourage participation at this point.
Thank you to everyone for your questions. Tom, what would you like the audience to remember from today's program?
That's a good question. And I think, some of those basic points about marten are really important, that there would not be big negative impacts to other species, what that habitat looks like, that we have that availability. But I guess just to remember that all of us, wildlife belongs to all of us, and all of us need to take that active role as best we can, whether that's habitat management on our own properties or weighing in on issues like this. I think it's just really important that we remain active within this wildlife management sphere and just continue to kind of own up to helping to manage wildlife within our state, because we're very, very proud of what we've done, and we've built this legacy of restoring wildlife to Pennsylvania, and we want to continue to do that.
This has been great. Thank you, Tom, so much for being part of this program today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Great questions all.
So to explore more about this topic, you can visit the Pennsylvania Game Commission's website or the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website. Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. You can visit the State Museum's website for program information and to sign up.